Greetings, students. We are back at it. Apparently, we're going to have 3 lectures on the apology, right? So the first one was on background knowledge. We didn't really get into the details of the text. So that's what we're going to do now. But, we especially looked at Socrates' past associations. We looked at the Peloponnesian War. We looked at the history of philosophy, what the pre-Socratic philosophers had been up to, and what the sophists were doing in Athens during Socrates' time, right? That was what we emphasized in that first lecture. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the early accusations and how Socrates handles them. For the second week of class, we will talk about the official charges against Socrates. We're not going to get into those here. Okay, so here we go. Let's look at the structure of the apology and see where the early accusations fit in. Okay, so here we are looking at the structure of the apology. This is the content of it. In other words, mostly it's defense, as you can see by looking at the slide, and then the counter assessment and the final address, and we'll explain what those things are. But yeah, mostly this is defense. This is Socrates defending himself at his trial. The Greek term at issue here that's being translated as apology is apologia. Okay, so Plato apparently himself titled this apologia, and apology sounds like apologia, and the words are clearly etymologically related. So we have this tradition of translating apologia as apology. However, apologia just means defense, right? And Socrates is not apologetic in his defense. We mustn't think that just because of the title. So yeah, do keep in mind that the Greek term here is apologia, and it just means defense. Okay, so looking at that part of the text, we can analyze that into parts. So we've got the defense against the early accusations, or the older charges, we could call them that. We've got defense, or the defense against the more recent charges, or really the official charges, the ones that are actually stated in the affidavit that was filed with the court. And then we have Socrates' defense of his life and his life's work. Okay, so let's go over these one at a time, and then we'll talk about the other parts. So there's the defense against the early accusations. Let's mention them again. Number 1, Socrates studies things in the sky and below the earth. Number 2, he makes the weak argument the stronger. And by the way, there's a third element to this that I haven't really brought up. He teaches these things to others. So there's this explicit mention of him being a teacher and teaching the young, right? Now, what does it mean that these are early accusations or older charges? Well, it means they're not official. They're not on the written affidavit. They're slander, right? They're rumors. They're things that people say about Socrates. They've been saying these things about Socrates for a long time. Socrates doesn't have to talk about them to be clear. That's his choice, right? Since they're not official charges and they're not in the written affidavit, Socrates does not have to bring them up. He decides to bring them up. Why? Well, because he thinks people wouldn't believe the official charges if they hadn't been making all these accusations that are you know connected to the pre-Socratics and the sophists, as we've tried to explain. People wouldn't believe the official charges if those rumors connected to these other philosophers hadn't been circulating for many years. So Socrates thinks he should nip the slander in the bud, and then he can deal with the official charges. It makes sense. I don't know if it's a good strategy. It didn't keep him from being convicted, but he did think he should address it, and maybe he just did what he wanted. Ultimately, he doesn't seem to be afraid of being found guilty or of being sentenced to death, so maybe he just talked about what he really wanted to talk about here, and he wanted to talk about these early accusations. Okay. So I'm not sure what else we should say about them. Again, we've tried to connect this idea that Socrates studies things in the sky and below the earth to the pre-Socratics. I guess I'll go over that one more time. Thales and Anaximander, etc., they were interested in what was going on in the heavens, and they had theories about it, right? So everything's made of water, or everything's made of the aporon. Anaximenes seems to have had some more specific theories about specific celestial bodies, but we just have these little fragments. We don't know exactly how it was all supposed to work, right? Anaxagoras, who's not a Milesian, is mentioned in the text, and Anaxagoras thought the moon was made of stone. So that's the sort of thing the pre-Socratics were known for, and that's the sort of thing Socrates is getting associated with. Theories about celestial bodies, which are, from our perspective, in the sky. So that's where this idea that they're studying things in the sky is coming from, below the earth. Similar idea. These pre-Socratics were interested in what everything was made of, including the ground they were standing on. What is this body that we're on? So they had theories about that, right? So they were studying things in the sky and below the earth. And by the way, they weren't mentioning the gods, right? So they were proceeding in a non-religious way. It's not fair to say they were atheists. Some of them seem to have espoused religious beliefs, right? But they were trying to do something like modern science. It wasn't yet modern science, but they were trying to give physical accounts of physical phenomena without appealing to the gods, right? And so that looks impious or sacrilegious. Okay, and so that's why Socrates is in trouble through his association with these other philosophers, even though Socrates doesn't seem to be a student of natural phenomena. That's not his thing. Okay, and then the sophists made the weak argument the stronger. That would be a way to characterize what they were doing. So again, Socrates is getting lumped in with them. That's where this other early accusation seems to come from. What does it mean to make the weak argument the stronger? Well, again, I'm speculating about what exactly Gorgias did here, but he seems to have put forward this view that nothing exists as a challenge, right? So he would get up in front of people and say, nothing exists, prove me wrong. That seems to be how it went. So they would try, right? And then he would prove that they were wrong, and he would be able to defend his apparently weak, silly even view that nothing exists. I mean, what a silly thing to say, but that was the point. I can take this proposition that nobody believes, right? And I can defend it against people who are attacking me and trying to prove that I'm wrong. And that showed Gorgias's rhetorical skill. And he was probably trying to show how rhetoric was very powerful and could shape reality. And so that's the sort of thing that Athenians would see as making the weak argument the stronger, right? And then there's this idea that Socrates teaches these things to others. Well, the first one is sacrilegious, and then the second one is sort of sinister in undermining the very idea of truth. So, yeah, I mean, it would be suspicious of Socrates to teach such things to others, although, other people had actually taught those things and had mostly survived. Anaxagoras did have to flee Athens, right, for his teachings, which were considered sacrilegious. So, okay. Maybe Athens has been somewhat consistent in their view that you shouldn't teach such things, but I do think they had it in for Socrates specifically. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on here, the early accusations, and then of course there's what was filed with the court. Socrates corrupts the youth. He is impious in that he believes in these strange new gods, not in the city's gods, but in strange new spiritual things. Okay, so we'll defend Socrates, or we'll explain Socrates' defense against the official charges in the next video. And then there's Socrates' defense of his life and his mission. This is a large part of the text. I mean, maybe it's a surprisingly large part of the text. It is to me a little bit, because, he didn't have to talk about the slander to begin with, but that was his choice. He has to address the official charges. Why does he spend so much time talking after he quite clearly says, well, that's enough to defend myself against these official charges? I believe it's because the charges are vague. Impiety is pretty vague. Corrupting the youth, what does that mean? How? Corrupt them how? That's pretty vague. So it makes sense for Socrates to spend a while just saying, I'm a good guy, I have good intentions, here are some anecdotes to show that my intention has been to benefit Athens. As a matter of fact, the paradox of Socrates emerges really strongly here. So I've mentioned the irony, I've mentioned there's something paradoxical about this person. He doesn't know anything worthwhile. That's what he always comes back to. He says it again and again. But he is really confident that he's been good for Athens, right? I mean, you can't miss it. It's definitely there in the text. He's not wondering whether he's been beneficial to Athens. He's not ignorant of that fact. If it's a fact, he believes strongly that he's been a benefit to Athens. So it's odd. It's hard to know what to make of that, and I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm going to let you think about it. What are we to make of this paradox? What are we to make of this irony, this existential irony that Socrates exhibits? Okay. Counter assessment. Right, again, the defense takes up almost all of the text. What is this counter assessment? The way these trials worked is this. The prosecutor is supposed to assess the penalty after guilt has been found. So there's a break in the text, in other words. So there's Socrates defending himself. And then what we don't see in the text is the jury deliberating and finding Socrates guilty. That has to happen before the counter assessment, but there's no record of it, right? And then the prosecutor has to propose a penalty and say, this is how the defendant should be punished now that the defendant has been found guilty. And that's not in the text either. That's just happening in this break. It's not there, right? What we do get is Socrates' response to what the prosecutor has said, to what Meletus has said. Here's what I think the penalty should be, right? And then this is supposed to make both sides moderate. That's why the trials are structured in this way, right? The idea is if the prosecutor goes too far and asks for a punishment that's too harsh, then the jury might be moved to pick the defendant's proposal or the defendant's proposed penalty. Right, so the prosecutor better not go too far and ask for too much. Similarly, the defendant had better not ask for a punishment that's too lenient, right, because that'll push the jury back toward what the prosecutor has proposed. Okay, so the trials are structured this way to make people be moderate in what they're asking for. It just didn't happen in this case, right? Meletus says kill him, proposes the death penalty, even though the charges are weird, ultimately. And then Socrates says, can you just give me free meals and let me stay in this sort of fancy town hall, the Prytaneum? Can you just put me up for free and give me some free food, right? That's what Socrates proposes at first. He does say some other things, but that's his initial proposal. That's his initial counter assessment. Okay, and then we get the final address, right? And I already mentioned this part. It looks unrealistic. Okay, probably didn't happen, but in the text, Socrates reassures his friends and he tries to tell them that, hey, this is good, I think. My death coming right now at this time, I think it's a good thing. But then he also warns the people who voted for his guilt. He doesn't think they've been sincere. He doesn't think they're really judging based on the evidence. He thinks they have animus against Socrates, and so they haven't been good jurors. They haven't upheld their oaths as jurors, and they've made oaths to the gods, right? So they've been impious in their way as far as Socrates is concerned. Okay, so he says all that in the final address. Okay, so that's the structure. All right, so how does Socrates actually deal with the early accusations? Well, he tells a story, right? He says, I cannot deny that I have a reputation for being odd. That's basically what he says. I have an extraordinary reputation. People consider me strange. Why? What does this all go back to? And he says, it has to do with the oracle at Delphi, which is a city other than Athens. It's another Greek city-state. Okay, so this guy, Chaerephon, who was Socrates' friend, according to Socrates, Chaerephon went to the oracle and said, is any man wiser than Socrates? And the oracle said, no, no one is wiser. Okay, and this is a very important oracle Delphi is called the navel of the earth. In other words, the Greeks thought of it as being at the center of things somehow, so it's a very important religious location. This temple at Delphi was built on a system of caverns, okay? And in the caverns, there is this sweet smelling gas called ethylene. And ethylene is, in mild doses, it's an anesthetic, so it could make you feel good, right? You can't feel your pains anymore if you get exposed to mild doses of ethylene. And then if you get a lot of ethylene, well, you might hallucinate. Okay, so the oracle, who is this person who's supposed to speak on behalf of the god, might have hallucinated some of the time and probably said some pretty wild stuff. So this was a famous oracle, and people paid a lot of attention to this oracle. Okay, and this temple at Delphi is dedicated to Apollo. So Socrates tends to talk about the god and his mission from the god. He's talking about Apollo, to be clear, right? When he says, the god asked me to go question all these people about whether they were wise, he means Apollo specifically. And the sense in which Apollo told Socrates to go question the wise is, well, Apollo's oracle said no one was wiser, right? And then Socrates didn't believe it because he thought, well, lots of people know some really important things that I don't know. So that cannot be right, which, by the way, sounds a little sacrilegious, but that he does admit that. So the god said no one's wiser, but I didn't really believe what the god said because so many people know all these really cool things that I don't know. And so what I did is I set out to go question people with reputations for wisdom and to see whether it was really true. Basically, he's testing the god's statement, right? It's like a hypothesis, and Socrates is going to test it and see whether it's really true. What does the evidence actually tell us? So, as you know from reading the text, he goes to the politicians. It says in the text he went to one of our public men. He's talking about politicians, and what does politician mean here? Okay, so I haven't quite said this yet. Athens is a direct democracy. I mentioned that it's a democracy. I didn't mention that it's a direct democracy. What does that mean? It means every citizen, which excludes women, because it's a sexist society, but every male citizen, I guess, is in the assembly, which is the legislative body of Athens, right? In other words, everybody's a legislator, right? That's the idea, because everybody's in the assembly. All the male citizens, at least, if they're old enough, they're in the assembly. That's the legislative body. So, if we were in Athens, I'm a legislator, you're a legislator, everybody's a legislator, right? So that's what's meant by direct democracy, right? We're in a representative democracy. So I go and I vote for my favored candidate to represent me in the legislature and in Congress, right? There's the state legislature, there's the federal Congress. We send representatives to go legislate for us, but in Athens, everybody was a legislator, right? So what does it mean to go question the politicians? People who were prominent in the assembly, people who stood up and gave speeches, right? I mean, if everybody's in the assembly and there are tens of thousands of people in the assembly, then yeah, some people are going to be prominent, right? Some people are going to be known for getting up and making speeches and getting people to vote for their legislation. So that's what he's talking about. He went to some of those people, right? And what did he ask them? Well, we don't know exactly, but I imagine it was probably something like, well, what is justice? What is a just government? How can a government rule on behalf of all the people? How can it take care of all the people? You know, things like that. And then according to the text, people couldn't give him consistent answers. So we've already talked about the Socratic method. Socrates is looking for he's looking for inconsistencies. So they try to say what just government is, or what enlightened rule is, or what, whatever they were talking about, and they don't give good answers. They're not ready to be interrogated by Socrates, and they don't hold up well. Okay? So he's disappointed in the politicians. They don't know what he thought they knew. Okay? And their confidence is too high. They have too much esteem in their own level of knowledge. It doesn't match what they actually know. So here's the esteem and here's the actual level of knowledge. There's a mismatch. Okay? And then Socrates goes to the poets and interrogates them, and that might seem odd. Who who are the poets that you should go interrogate them? Well, it's similar actually to why he interrogated the politicians first. The poets are held in high esteem, right? I mean, you've at least heard of Homer. So where do the Greeks get their ideas of the gods from? Well, from Homer and Hesiod, largely, who are famous poets. They're important Greek poets. So the poets were thought to be very wise. They wrote amazing poetry that contained, truths, deep truths about life and human beings and human existence. And so certainly made sense in Athens, in ancient Greece, to go interrogate the poets next. And then, as Socrates says, well, they couldn't explain their poems very well, so they seemed to write from inspiration rather than from knowledge. So again, Socrates is disappointed, and again, he thinks that the poets were overconfident. They had too much esteem in their own knowledge. So again, here's the esteem, here's the actual level of knowledge. There's a mismatch. They think they know more than they do. It's a problem. And then finally, Socrates goes to the artisans or the craftsmen, it says in the text, I believe, and interrogates them. And their reputation is the lowest of the three groups, right? Politicians, those are our leaders. So yeah, way up here. Their reputation's way up here. Poets, pretty important, but not everybody's Homer, so they're a little below the politicians apparently. Socrates did talk to them second. And then the craftspeople, they're they know stuff, it looks like, but gosh, they're not as important as our political leaders and the people informing us about the gods. So they have the lowest reputation, but Socrates is most impressed with them because they know something, right? Socrates is not convinced that the politicians know anything, and he's not convinced that the poets know anything. He says, again, they wrote from inspiration, not knowledge. The craftspeople know stuff. They can tell Socrates how to make things. They can tell him how to make a pot on a potter's wheel, or they can tell him how to weave a basket or a rug or whatever. They can tell him lots of different things. They can prove they have knowledge because, look, they can make things. So they can demonstrate their knowledge. So they know something. They're coming off a little better than the other groups. But their confidence level is still too high. They think they know things they don't know. So Socrates asks them about virtue, and probably asks them about specific virtues, well, what is wisdom? What is courage? Or he might have even asked them, well, what is it to have skill at a craft? And then they can't talk about abstract things like that. Again, they're not ready for Socrates. They don't have a good answer for him. And so he's able to point to inconsistencies in what they say. Right, and so he tested the God's hypothesis and he decided that, yeah, okay, I guess the God was right. Very nice of him to make such a concession. So Socrates is wise. He kind of has to admit it, but only in a special sense of the word wisdom. Socrates is wise in realizing that he doesn't know anything worthwhile and in not thinking he knows things that he doesn't know. So from Socrates' perspective, this is his view of things. Most people delude themselves into thinking they know what they don't know. They get complacent. They say things without interrogating themselves enough, and it's idle talk, and they can't back it up. So yeah, they have too much confidence in what they're saying, and they don't think about it deeply enough. They're not skeptical enough of their own knowledge. But Socrates is very skeptical of his own knowledge and his own level of knowledge, and so he doesn't go around claiming to know things that he doesn't know, right? He tends to not make knowledge claims on his own behalf. He'd rather listen to other people. So again, it's paradoxical. He's very humble and he's very confident. He's not going to make claims to knowledge, but he's also very confident in being a benefit to Athens. He's confident that he's doing what the God wants him to do. He's confident that his interrogations are useful in showing that other people's claims to knowledge are inflated. Okay, so anyway, this is the story. This is basically how Socrates responded to the oracle's claim. Okay, and what do we make of this ultimately? Okay, so an argument has emerged here, we think. What is the argument? This slide's a little wordy. The next one is more pithy. So let's talk through the argument and then get to the pithy version. So there's the concession that Socrates starts with. There's good strategy here. You got to pick your battles, right? So what am I going to try to fight? What am I not going to try to fight? What will I concede or admit? I think it's good strategy for Socrates to admit that he's wise. That's the reputation. But he's going to redefine wisdom. Okay, so his self-awareness plays a really important role here. He's aware that he doesn't know much. He's got to reconcile this with the God's statement that he's wise. Okay, how do we reconcile this? Well, he does go and interrogate others who are known for knowing things about politics or poetry or whatever, and he finds that they don't hold up very well under questioning, right? So he finds in general that people are foolish in the sense that they think they know more than they do, which puts Socrates himself in a good light as someone who is aware that he doesn't know much and that what he knows isn't very worthwhile, right? So that is what enables him to redefine wisdom in a useful way. useful to his case, if nothing else, right? Yes, I'm wise. That does not entail that I'm knowledgeable. Sometimes we use wise and knowledgeable as near synonyms. We don't think of them as exactly the same, but we think they go together. Socrates is taking them apart. I'm wise, but the sense in which I'm wise does not entail that I'm knowledgeable. As a matter of fact, my wisdom consists in knowing that I don't have worthwhile knowledge. Okay? And then, so finally, the point is, look, some people study things in the sky and below the earth, and they make extravagant theories about celestial phenomena and all that, and that's cool. I'm not going to put those people down. Maybe the Athenians want to kill them or whatever. It's not, it's not for me to say. But anyway, that's not me, right? So they at least have knowledge of the phenomena that they're making theories about, right? They know a lot about how the moon moves in the sky and stuff like that, right? You have to be knowledgeable to make those theories, okay? Socrates doesn't go around talking about the movements of celestial bodies in the sky and what it means and what they're made of. So maybe they know something, but whatever it is they know, it's not the same thing that Socrates knows. So he doesn't study things in the sky and below the earth. Similar points hold for the other early accusation that Socrates makes the weak argument the stronger. He spends a lot of time distinguishing himself from the sophists, specifically, right? He doesn't really put forward claims because he doesn't really know anything. I mean, that's the stance, at least. He's going around asking people things. He's not telling them things, right? He doesn't put on a show. He doesn't talk when people pay him and then refuse to talk if they don't pay him. That's what a sophist does, right? Okay, so he doesn't make the weak argument the stronger. He doesn't know anything about that. He's an interrogator, a questioner, not an asserter, right? He doesn't have a position. He doesn't assert things. He looks into things in general, right? Okay. So his kind of wisdom doesn't match the wisdom of someone who makes the weak argument the stronger. His kind of wisdom doesn't match the kind of wisdom of someone who studies things in the sky and below the earth. He doesn't have the kind of wisdom that can be taught. It could be emulated, but not taught. There's no content to teach, right? He doesn't know anything worthwhile. His wisdom consists in realizing that there's nothing there to teach, right? So we can see how the story that Socrates is told about what the oracle said and about his response to the oracle amounts to an argument that these early accusations must be false. Okay, here is the pithy version of the argument. Can we sum it up? Yes, we can sum it up. In sum, Socrates is wise only in the sense that he is very aware of his own ignorance. So his wisdom, so-called, does not involve any knowledge of metaphysics. That's what the pre-Socratics seem to have, knowledge of metaphysics. Or rhetoric. That's what the sophists seemed to have, knowledge of rhetoric. Consequently, the early accusations are false. Okay? Keeping the structure of the apology in mind, which we've been over, what we have to deal with next are the official charges. Okay? But this is it for week 1. So in week 1, we're just getting introduced to philosophy, and we're getting to know Socrates, and we're getting into the apology enough to know how he deals with the early accusations. So soon I will post a lecture about how he deals with the official charges. And then after that, the Crito. Right, so week 2 we finish the Apology and we talk about the Crito. Week 3, if you really want to know that far ahead, the Euthyphro, and then excerpts from Platonic dialogues, not Socratic dialogues. Excerpts from Platonic dialogues that are supposed to tell us something about Plato's theory of the forms. All right, stay tuned for all that. Thanks.